Common myths and misconceptions about crossbows. That's this episode of Death by Bunjie. I was successful hunting with Bunjie here in my first season hunting deer here in northeastern Pennsylvania with the crossbow back in 2010. I posted a nice video about that before. You can watch that here on this channel. Right after I had shot that deer, I was talking to a friend of mine, somebody who I have a lot of respect for. He's a former game commission official, and I was explaining to him how great the crossbow was, how much fun I had in the woods, and how accurate it was, and how I shot this deer at 12 yards, and how proud I was of that on my first season using the crossbow. He listened to me politely, and at the end of that he said, yeah, the problem with those crossbows is that they shoot a lot farther than all the other archery equipment. It occurred to me he really wasn't listening to my story where I told him I had shot that deer at 12 yards. But that is the reason I'm doing this video, is to dispel some of those rumors and get rid of some of those myths and address some of those myths about crossbow hunting. Two reasons to do that. Number one, I don't want people out there having these misconceptions about what this weapon does, because it's bad PR, bad public relations for crossbow and for crossbow hunting. Secondly, I also want to make sure that people who might be getting into crossbow hunting don't have any of those same misconceptions. And that is myth number one. Crossbows simply do not shoot farther accurately and safely than compound bows. They simply do not. One of the big misconceptions I think about that is, and the reasons for that myth, is that crossbows, when you look at the specs, this has a 175-pound draw weight. And there's probably no human alive who can pull back a regular compound bow that has a 175-pound draw weight. So your initial reaction is, wow, these things are twice as powerful or 3 times as powerful as compound bows. But that's simply not true. You're comparing apples and oranges. That draw weight is the measurement of the tension of the limbs when you pull the string back at full draw and lock it in here in the trigger mechanism. That is the draw weight. That defines the draw weight. When you pull that back and cock that crossbow, it's holding 175 pounds back at full draw. Your compound bow pulls a lot less. 60 pounds, I think you got like minimums of 35 pounds in most states to go hunting with. So when people hear 175 pounds, they start thinking, wow, that's incredible. And some of them today, 200, 250 pound draw weights on those crossbows. If you don't look into it further, it does seem as though that's a lot more powerful, and therefore it would shoot farther, but it simply isn't the case. The drawback with crossbows is that they shoot shorter arrows, for one. That shorter arrow does not have accuracy at long distances the way a longer arrow does. Think of it this way. Remember back when you were a kid in elementary school and you make paper airplanes and throw them around the classroom? If you folded the paper lengthwise and threw that paper airplane, then it would go quite a long distance and it would go nice and accurate and everything else. If you folded the paper widthwise, however, and made a shorter, stubbier paper airplane, that paper airplane did loops and went all over the place. Similar with crossbows. The arrow is shorter. It simply is not designed to shoot long distances. Now I know if you look at the New York Bow Hunters website, one of their concerns about the crossbow and their complaints about the crossbow was the fact that it has a scope. That's what, in their opinion, helps separate it from archery equipment. But they complain on there that these scopes go out to 50, 60, 70 yards and all that sort of thing. In fact, Bunjie's scope goes out to 50 yards. I can tell you from experience, I've never taken a shot past 35 yards. I think it's probably the longest shot I've ever taken. I'd have to think back. But 30 yards, 35 yards seems awfully far for me. 50 yards, I have practiced at 50 yards and will not take a shot at 50 yards, because 50 yards to me, when I'm sitting in the yard shooting at 50 yards, I wouldn't shoot at an animal at that distance because it just seems so far. The animal is so far away, and it just doesn't seem practical to me. Also defeats the purpose of crossbow hunting in the first place. What I like about it, one of the most important things to me about crossbow hunting, is getting up close and personal with deer, with the animals that you're hunting, and being able to observe them in their natural, unstressed environment. That's very important to me. Crossbow hunting allows me to do that. So shooting at a long distance with a crossbow doesn't really make sense to me. The other thing I want to point out about long distance shots, long distance hunting, is the New York bow hunters need to look at what bow hunters do in western states. before they criticize crossbow hunters for shooting long distances. I have a friend who lives in Arizona. I've hunted with him on a couple of occasions, gone out there and hunted, and I've hunted with him here in Pennsylvania. He moved out in Arizona several years ago and has hunted out there quite a bit. And he visits all the archery shops, talks to a lot of archers out there in Arizona, and some of you may be familiar with archers in Arizona or Western hunting. The compound bow folks out there, it's not uncommon for them to take 80-yard or even 100-yard shots on deer. To me, I can't do that. I can't imagine being able to shoot a deer with a compound bow at 40 yards. I don't have that skill. I don't develop those skills. But long distance like that is quite common. It's actually, the game out there is more spread out. They don't have the dense vegetation like we do here, trees and stuff all over the place and branches. They got a lot of ground cover with cactus and other types of plants, but long shots like that are not uncommon out west, and they are done with bows. In fact, the crossbow simply doesn't accommodate those kinds of long shots out there on deer and animals like that. Because it's not really as good at those longer distances, not as useful, not as practical for those longer distances. Because of that, if you look, Arizona is one of those states, and there's probably a couple others, where it doesn't have crossbows legalized fully in the archery seasons, and there's not really a movement to do so. There aren't a lot of people out there who want to hunt with crossbows during the archery seasons in Arizona, due largely in part to the fact that the compound bow is a more effective long-range hunting tool than most crossbows. You might be familiar with Tim Wells from YouTube or from his shows on the hunting channels on television. He routinely takes long shots with his compound bow, some of them in excess of 100 yards. The second state is number one in my book. Myth number 2 about crossbows. Crossbows are easier to hunt with than vertical bows, and therefore they give the hunter an unfair advantage in archery seasons. Now, it depends on what you're talking about here, there's some truth to this. And I've mentioned before on here that one of the reasons, the big part of the attraction of the crossbow to me, and I think to a lot of people, is that you don't have to spend hours every week out in the yard shooting your crossbow. We live in a society where we all have to work, we got to make money, or we can't buy crossbows. We can't do all the fun things if we don't have jobs and don't take care of our responsibilities. In addition to that, we have families. I like to spend time with my family. I like to watch movies. I like to go places with my family and spend time with my little girl, and I like to spend time with my wife as much as I can. And spending hours out in the yard doing that would take me away from that. Crossbows cuts a lot of that out because once it's sighted in, you can be pretty proficient with a crossbow. Now, I am not in any way suggesting that you shouldn't spend hours with your crossbow preparing for hunting seasons. Go out there, know everything about your crossbow, feel comfortable with it, know what it does, what it doesn't do. Know enough about your crossbow and feel comfortable enough with your crossbow so that when you are out there hunting, all of those possibilities are eliminated for error and you can make the best shot you can possibly make. That being said, also, it isn't necessarily easier to hunt with a crossbow than it is with a compound bow. There are a lot of disadvantages to crossbow. One of them is distance. I don't think you can feel as comfortable at long distances with a crossbow, or I don't think you should feel as comfortable at long distances with a crossbow as you might with a compound bow. That's number one. Number two, you're sitting in a tree stand moving around with this thing. It's already cocked. It's true that you don't have to hold it at full draw the way you do a compound bow, but try sitting in a tree stand sometime with this weapon, with these long limbs, and there's some crossbows that are narrower. There's some that are very narrow, actually. But my crossbow, for example, Bunjie here, is a recurved crossbow. The limbs are real wide. It takes up a lot of space. Walking through the woods with this thing is like carrying a Christmas tree over your shoulder or something, walking through the woods. It tends to get caught on everything. And sitting in a tree stand with it or carrying it in front of you is like sitting on the couch with a pizza box on your lap or something. I mean, it takes up a lot of space. It really does. Not necessarily convenient in that sense, but also I can't take follow-up shots as easily with a crossbow. It takes me 30 seconds to a minute to recock this crossbow and load another arrow to get a second shot. You don't get too many opportunities to do that. With a compound bow, there's a quicker follow-up shot. The crossbow is also louder than compound bows. You can be a little bit sneakier with your compound bow and not make as much noise and maybe get that follow-up shot. You probably have seen videos on YouTube of people taking a shot at a deer. The deer looks around, they take a follow-up shot and hit the deer. That's different from the crossbow. When I fire this, every deer in the area knows that something just happened. They all know it. The sound of this going off, plus the sound of that arrow hitting the deer's hide, that alerts every deer in the area that there's something going on. So you really don't get follow-up shots with a crossbow. Now, some crossbows are a lot quieter. There are things, and I'll do videos about this down the road, there are things you can do to quiet this down a little bit. And there are crossbows that are a lot quieter. But generally speaking, they are not as quiet as compound bows. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of them, but I don't believe that the crossbow gives you overall some kind of unfair advantage in archery seasons. Myth number 3 about crossbows. I shouldn't get into crossbow hunting because even though it's legal right now in my state, it may be illegal in the near future. I don't think that that's the trend as far as crossbows are concerned. In 2009, a lot of talk about legalizing the crossbow. In fact, they voted to legalize the crossbow in archery seasons here in Pennsylvania in 2009. Lots of states had done it before that. Lots of states have done it since. But in 2009, they were also going back and forth. In fact, they tried to rescind that legalization, but they'd already printed all of the pamphlets. There's an interesting little story about that. The Game Commission had already printed the bulletin showing that the crossbow was a legal hunting implement, and because that means that now all of a sudden there's going to be people out in the woods hunting with a crossbow, thinking it was legal, having a legitimate excuse for why they thought it was legal, and find out it wasn't legal. They had to actually go back on their rescinding it and then keep it legal. 2010, it went up for a vote again, I think, but nonetheless, it's been legal ever since. It never was rescinded, and crossbows have been legal ever since. There's really no legitimate, significant movement out there to make the crossbow an illegal archery hunting implement here in Pennsylvania. Your state may be different. Right up north of me in New York State, they are still battling it out. If you look at the New York Bow Hunters website, they say on the website that they're glad that the matter is settled, and now crossbows are only legal in the last 2 weeks of the archery season. I don't think the matter's settled. There is still a New York Crossbow Coalition. Those folks are still trying to get the crossbow legalized throughout the archery season in New York State, and ultimately, eventually, I think they will be successful. Myth number 4 about crossbow hunting. If we allow crossbows during the archery season, they'll kill all the deer and there won't be any deer left for the rest of us. There's a lot of different versions of this myth. You hear people say things like that from time to time, but in reality, that has not been the case in states that have legalized the crossbow. In Pennsylvania, for example, looking back in the 1990s, bow hunting reached its peak somewhere around 300,000 licensed archery hunters during that time, during that decade. By the mid-2000s, that number had dipped to 250,000 licensed archers. So more than 50,000 people had actually left the bow hunting ranks. They legalized crossbows in 2009. By 2012, the number had gone back up to 312,000 archers. So it didn't increase the number of people in the woods hunting with archery equipment necessarily. All it did was restore the numbers to what they had previously been. In other words, the same number of people were out in the woods hunting. And I can tell you anecdotally from my experience, I have no trouble seeing deer here in northeastern Pennsylvania. I see 2 a week killed on my way to work by cars. So there's lots of deer around, and every time I go hunting I see deer, and I work very hard on habitat management, work very hard on food plots. Those of you watching this channel know that. That is a big part of it, and I think you need to take responsibility for furthering the species that you're hunting. You got to take some responsibility and go out there and try and make habitat better and improve those deer numbers and make that deer herd healthier. That's very important for all of us to participate in that in some fashion, I believe. If you're doing that, you have every right to go out there with a crossbow if it's legal during your archery seasons. Which brings me to myth number 5 about crossbows. If crossbows are legal, hunters will go out into the woods with crossbows and they wound all the deer. They'll wound the deer, they won't find them, they won't kill them, they won't take good shots, they won't put in the energy needed to do the follow-up to find those deer, and that's going to decrease the number of healthy deer in the area. Simply not true. Now, you hear this from 2 different groups. On one hand, you got the compound bow hunters, the New York Bow Hunters Association, and groups like that perpetuate this myth. On their website, for example, the New York Bow Hunters cite some kind of study out of Canada that showed that 40% of the crossbow hunters wounded deer compared to only 20% of compound bow hunters who wounded deer. I don't know anything about that study. They don't give any details. They just say it was a study. On the other hand, you got the rifle hunters who say that if we allow people out there with crossbows, it's increasing the archery numbers, and more people are killing those nice bucks during the archery season, and there's no nice bucks left over for us during the rifle season. In fact, the argument that crossbow hunters wound more deer and don't find them is completely bogus. If you need proof, look at current Pennsylvania Game Commission statistics. For the first time in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania since 2013, crossbows have killed and recorded the harvest of more deer during the archery seasons than compound bows. So there are more hunters who are successful with crossbows during the archery seasons than with compound bows. If anything, that tells you that the crossbow is an effective hunting implement and that the people who are using it well. Myth number 6 about crossbows and crossbow hunting. Crossbows have so much more power that they ruin my targets and therefore I can't shoot them at my local range. If you're in a suburban area or an urban area or any place where you go regularly to a range to shoot your archery equipment instead of the backyard or front yard like I do, then that might be an issue. A lot of different places do ban crossbows, don't allow them because of the damage that they will do to targets. But there's a couple of reasons for that. I've mentioned this before. One important difference between the crossbow and other hunting implements is the fact that that arrow is going to be shorter. It's a lot easier to get that arrow to actually penetrate fully into the target, or maybe even get a pass through on a target with a shorter arrow than it is a longer arrow. That's a benefit when you're hunting, because you want a pass through. I'd rather have a blood trail coming from 2 holes than 1. I'd rather have 2 blood trails to follow. That's just going to improve your odds of finding a deer. The shorter arrow helps make that happen. It's easier to push 20 inches of arrow through a deer than it is to push 32 inches of arrow through a deer, for example. Same thing with a target. It's true that broadheads do damage to any target that you shoot, but if you are shooting at a proper crossbow target, it shouldn't make any difference. Myth number 7 about crossbows. Crossbows are not archery equipment. I beg to differ. History begs to differ. These were in use in medieval times, right alongside longbows, long before compound bows were invented or designed. So they are archery equipment. And if you've hunted with one, you can see why this is different from a rifle. It simply is not the same. Just like all archery equipment, to me the key is, do I have to be close to the animal in order to get a shot? You absolutely do, and should be with a crossbow. Shouldn't make any difference. There are advantages and disadvantages to crossbows. There are advantages and disadvantages with compound bows. But keep in mind, there are advantages and disadvantages between different types of crossbows, recurve versus compound. And there are advantages and disadvantages between different types of compound bows, or compound bows versus recurve bows or longbows or whatever. These different types of bows, they're all different, but they're all archery equipment. Most importantly, the definition of archery equipment to me, and this comes in part because I'm a lawyer, but the definition of archery equipment should be what your state defines archery equipment as. This, according to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, is archery equipment, and therefore, it's archery. Myth number 8. Crossbows will increase poaching. There's no truth to that whatsoever. Ohio, for example, the first state to fully authorize the crossbow in all of their hunting seasons. What a great state, Ohio, and I hope to visit there soon someday and do some deer hunting there. But Ohio has actually issued statements that there's no difference between the use of crossbows versus compound bows in terms of their prosecutions for poaching. And in fact, neither one of those, archery equipment is not commonly used in poaching. Poaching is typically done by people with rifles. I can tell you anecdotally, this isn't any scientific study or anything like that, but locally here, when I am made aware of a poaching, and I do a lot of criminal defense work, that's what I do, I'm a lawyer, but I can tell you that when I see poaching charges here, it is typically done by rifle hunters. And I'm not knocking rifle hunters in any way, there just happens to be more rifle hunters. If people are going to break the law and don't have respect for that and don't want to participate in conservation the way the rest of us do, that's something that's just always going to be out there. It's always going to be a problem. I think rather than complain about what implement people use, maybe we ought to put our energy into convincing all of our fellow hunters out there not to be poachers. Myth number 9. The crossbow uses a scope and therefore it's a rifle. It's not archery equipment. Kind of touched on this on the other ones, but the reality is this scope doesn't give me an advantage of being able to shoot 50, 60 yards. It does make it a lot easier, I think, to get familiar with your crossbow, shoot a lot shorter distances, and keep those shots up close and be proficient with it without the hundreds of hours of practice throughout the off season, like a compound bow might require. That's true. However, it really doesn't give you an advantage in any other way. The other thing I would point out about the scope on this thing is it's very similar. I have reticles in there, but if you're a compound bow user, many of them, not all, but many of them use peep sights or some sort of sight on their bow, and that gives them illuminated pins where they can see the distances and gauge the distance that way. Really, there isn't much difference between having a scope on your crossbow or a sight on your compound bow. They're essentially serving the same function. Myth number 10 about crossbow hunting: crossbows won't bring any new hunters into the fold. The New York Bow Hunters Association website does point out something that's probably true, and that is that a lot of the people who picked up the crossbow weren't new to hunting. They just moved from rifle hunting to crossbow hunting. So now all of a sudden they were just moving from one season to another. There's probably some truth to that, but that can't account for all of the numbers. And you can't disagree with the fact that if you're new to hunting, you're a young kid, a crossbow is going to be a lot easier to get in the woods during the archery season with than a compound bow. You also can't argue with the fact that if you're 40 some years old and you want to start hunting with a crossbow. I was in my late 30s. I wanted to get involved in the archery season, and I jumped from rifle hunting to crossbow hunting. It was not that difficult to switch. I had to learn a lot of things, and that's one of the reasons I started this channel, so I could show you some of those little things and sort of speed up the learning process for a lot of people who might be new to it. As a matter of fact, many of our Death by Bunjie subscribers are people who are new to hunting and looking to get into crossbow hunting as their introduction to hunting in general. There's no question that this can have an impact and play a role in increasing hunting numbers, and that's a good thing. Well, there you have it, my top 10 myths about crossbow hunting. Ooh. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you'll subscribe and stick around, listen to more Death by Bunjie videos here down the road. Go back and check out all the previous videos if you're interested in this sort of thing. Like the Facebook page for regular updates there. And until next time, all hail Bunjie!
The second state is number one in my book. I grew up with Hatchie Malachi, and I grew up with Yamu. Agnes and Lee did a number on me, and this is where the zombies spawn.
They're coming to get you, Barbara. They're coming for you, Barbara. Look, there comes one of them now.
We cling to our guns and religion, full auto castle, dock, and crossbows too. School is out when buck season opens, and we've got oil and gas for you. The cops can't pull you over seatbelts. Motorcycles take those helmets off. We know cow tipping.